still elevated compared to the overall unemployment rate, and that bears some more exploring.
James in Seattle. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. I just want to clear up one thing right quick. The unemployment rate for blacks was the lowest during slavery. The unemployment rate was 0. So Trump is lying on that. Also, when Trump was the president and when Trump was not the president and Obama was, he was consistently saying that the unemployment numbers were lies, that they was not right. Who could believe these unemployment numbers with Trump, Steve Mnuchin, and these different people are now manipulating the numbers? All that is lies. There's no way that you can prove that the unemployment rate is that low. Why when Trump was running for president, he's saying that the numbers were lies and they're true now? And the last thing, we noticed that they always bring up how the numbers, when you cut taxes, the numbers are grow. During Reagan, when Reagan cut taxes, he also, what I'm trying to tell you, he allowed amnesty, which the Republicans are against. In 1 month, we had 1 million jobs created. The jobs were not created. They were jobs where people were here illegal, and they just went and got a Social Security number. Why do Republicans not raise the minimum wage? Because these low-paying jobs, but there's no way that you can prove. Greta, would you pull up some of the comments that Trump made about the unemployment rate, how it was rigged and crooked? And for office and not true. Use his own words against him.
Okay, well, let's take the question that you're asking, Sarah Cheney. How do they put together these numbers? Who's in charge of it? And does the president or the White House have any say in the monthly job reports that come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics?
Thanks for that question. So the Labor Department, like you said, puts together this report. They have surveyors. They work together with the Census Bureau as well, and they send these surveyors out to ask questions to Americans about their employment status, about their labor force status, about what they're seeing, just in all of those different areas. And they put this report together, and it's completely done by this government agency, and they publish it every month so that we can all look at this data and analyze it closely.
Matt in Baltimore. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I've been around a long time. I'm 92, a World War II vet, and this is one of the better economic growths I've seen. First, I want to comment. The subset of this economic growth is much more important than the overall number. The subset is that non-infrastructure jobs, manufacturing jobs, mining, things that require investment are increasing at a rapid rate. The overall reduction is due in a large part to service jobs, which require just hire somebody and then they do it. I would like your reporter to please comment on that.
Okay.
I have one other.
All right, now we'll have her respond. Go ahead.
Thank you. So we've actually seen the opposite. This year, the services sector of the economy, particularly hiring, but there are also other measures, has shown that services jobs are doing well. They have slowed some. Manufacturing, on the other hand, which accounts for a smaller share of the economy, and economists like to debate how important it is in today's environment, has seen some pullback due to various global forces.
Jane, Studio City, California.
Hi. Here's
Morning.
something that's very interesting. We're talking about unemployment hits a low, but people are working 4 or 5 jobs to survive. I read somewhere that if the minimum wage had kept pace with the economy, it would be something like $35 a month. An hour. People are begging for a lousy 15. This is a very false way to gauge how the economy is doing. Our streets are crumbling, our bridges are crumbling. nothing is being done.
Hey,
And
Mom,
we're talking about the
I want to know if you
unemployment
wanted me to
rate.
do anything around the house.
So, Sarah Cheney, does the Labor Department look at how many jobs people have? To her point, that people are working 2-3 jobs?
Yes, the Labor Department
All right,
looks
I'll
at,
check it out, all right?
what's called multiple job holders. I haven't looked at that statistic
Yeah, I'm
in
gonna pick
recent
them out
months, so I
today.
can't speak to it.
I have one from school next
But to the
Tuesday,
broader
so
point
do you guys
of,
wanna go
are
to
we
the
looking
Bible
beyond
class early
just
Tuesday?
the unemployment rate? Absolutely.
Do a walk-in?
And so
Because
there
I tried
are
to call
all these
them,
different
just walk in.
measures.
My professor
One
said
is
it's
what's called this broader measure of unemployment. It's the U6 rate. It measures, not just those who are unemployed, but those who are, part-time and they're looking for full-time jobs, or those who are too discouraged to look for work. And that rate has fallen to the lowest level since 2000.
Renee, Westchester, Pennsylvania.
Hi. What I wanted to say is the unemployment numbers are low because the baby boomers who are born between 42 and 62, most of them are retired or semi-retired, which means they're retired and working a part-time job. And if they lose that part-time job or whatever, they're just going to rely on their unemployment. So they're not going to, they're not going to rely on unemployment. They'll just go get another part-time job. And what the other caller said is true. A lot of people are working multiple jobs. Because where I live in Westchester, Pennsylvania, apartments, 2 bedrooms are like $1,500 to $2,000. And $10 an hour, which is a little bit more than minimum wage, would not pay for a closet here. And a lot of places in America. And a lot of the workers in America are underpaid. The wages are stagnant. And another thing, they bring a lot of people here to work from other countries with working visas, and I don't get that. And I hear all the time from other people, especially in IT, how they're put out of their jobs by people from overseas. And I don't understand that.
Okay, a lot there. Sarah Cheney, your thoughts.
Lots to chew on there. First of all, you bring up baby boomers, which is an interesting point. We oftentimes talk about baby boomers in the context of what's happening with the labor force participation rate, which is the share of Americans working or looking for work. Because the overall headline participation rate that includes baby boomers, so those ages 16 and over, has been stagnating in recent years, but that's generally a good sign because we know that baby boomers are retiring, and so that would put a downward pressure on that rate. Another measure to look at is the prime age participation rate, which largely excludes baby boomers. It's those who are of working age, 25 to 54, and that rate has been going up in recent years. You also brought up the topic of the cost of living and wages, which is really interesting. Costs for things like housing have been going up for several years, and in many cases outpacing wage growth, and that's made it hard for a lot of Americans to afford housing.
Which demographics are benefiting from the low unemployment rate? When you look at, white Americans versus Black, Hispanic, et cetera.
So it's been interesting. Over the past year or two, we've seen that those who were traditionally kind of left behind earlier on in the economic expansion have been benefiting more. So that includes, yesterday we saw, like I mentioned, the underemployment rate falling to the lowest level since 2000. The unemployment rate for Hispanic men fell to 3.0%, which is the lowest level for records there. And then also those with less education, high school dropouts, the jobless rate for that group has also been trending downward. I mean, an important caveat is that the jobless rate for high school dropouts is still elevated compared to those with a college degree, but it's been falling quickly, and that's a signal that employers are hiring people who they traditionally weren't considering.
President Trump yesterday addressed the latest jobs report. Here's what he had to say.
So the unemployment numbers just came out, and they're the best numbers we've had in over 50 years. The unemployment number is down to 3.5%, so that goes way, way back. We haven't had numbers like this in a long time. Wages are up by almost 3%. That's a fantastic increase for everybody out there working. We're very happy about those numbers. The stock market is substantially up as it was yesterday, and our country does well. Europe is not doing well. Asia is doing poorly, to put it mildly, and we continue to do very well with a miracle. But the unemployment numbers just came out, 3.5% unemployment, and that is a tremendous number, the lowest in over 50 years. So very happy, and I think really very important, again, I'll say, wages are up. When I was running, wages were nowhere. They were going down. And people were having 2 and 3 jobs, and they were making less money than they made 20 years before. Now wages are up, so we're very happy about that.
So President Trump saying wages are up 3%. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, September of 2019, the average hour earnings down 1 cent to $28.09. Since September 2018, though, hourly earnings have increased by 2.9%. Can you explain a little more?
Right. We oftentimes look at the annual measure. The monthly data can be fairly volatile. It's good to look at everything. And so wages, it's an interesting question because they're still growing, but they're not growing as fast as they were in previous months. And in September, the 2.9 figure was, according to some economists, a bit disappointing given that we were seeing above 3% wage growth for several months. And, you know, it begs the broader question of why does this even matter? Like, why should we even expect wages to be picking up? Well, it matters because if wages are growing quickly, then American consumers are probably feeling good. They're likely to go out and spend at stores. And with regards to why we should expect this, you know, we're in a pretty tight labor market. Unemployment fell to 3.5%, and so you would expect that employers are competing fiercely for workers and that they would have to ramp up wages to both attract and retain employees.
Does President Trump get credit for the economy right now? Does anyone get credit or blame for how the economy is turning along when, like you said, you have to look at months and years of data?
It's really difficult to establish a connection between a president or policies and what's going on in the economy. And so I think we have to look at the data and think of it in those terms.
What about the tax cuts that the Republicans passed? Has that impacted the economy, and does it show up in the data?
So what we saw last year, which was the first full year where the tax cuts went into effect, is last year was by many measures a very good year for the economy. Hiring was strong, business investment was on the upswing, and manufacturing was doing pretty well. Some economists attribute that to the what we call fiscal stimulus, i.e. the tax cut. We've seen slower growth this year. It's hard to know whether that is because the boost from the tax cut, if there was one, is fading, or whether it's just kind of part of the natural process of where we are in the economic expansion.
We're asking all of you to give us your reaction to the latest on the economy, but also, what is it like where you live? David in Detroit, Michigan, go ahead.
thank you, Greta. We love you so much here in Detroit, Michigan, and I want to thank your guest, Sarah, for coming on and sharing. I just, I figured that if I listen long enough, I'll hear my question being answered, and technically it was, because one of the former individuals who called in, she asked Sarah, well, if we have an economy, and I guess they kind of define it as being a gig economy, and you have people working 2 and 3 jobs, how does that factor into the finite matrix of the unemployment? Because even here in Detroit, where GM is on strike, you're still having industry impacted by the economic force. We're still seeing that a distraction, that the economy and jobs are not being added with the same robustness as it was at the last term of 44, President 44.
Okay, so do the numbers bear out what David was saying?
So I think what David, you bring up an interesting point about multiple job holders. I would like to look into that number a little more. But if you look broadly at all of the different unemployment measures that we talked about for demographic groups, if you look at the sector by sector job growth, you're right that there are definitely pockets of slowing, but generally yesterday's jobs report was a pretty solid report.
Let's go to Charles, Tallahassee, Florida. Charles, good morning to you.
Good morning, Greta and Sarah. I just want to put out 3 facts here, and Sarah, please tell me if I'm wrong. First of all, Trump is benefiting from Obama's policies with this economy. So in essence, this is I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a benefit of what Obama did in his policies for 8 years. Trump is benefiting from it. And like everything else that's good, he hijacks it. Everything that's bad, he projects it on others. But concerning the economy, job growth was increasing under Obama at a faster rate than what it's doing now under Trump. Unemployment was decreasing the same at a faster rate under Obama. Am I wrong about that? And if you add in inflation with job growth, you would see that everything was better, including the economy, under President Obama. Thank you.
Sarah Cheney?
Again, it's very hard to establish a connection between a president's policies and what's happening in the economy. You bring up an interesting point, though, that if your president, hypothetically, who steps into office right after a recession, of course the economy is doing poorly then, as opposed to if you step into office 5 years into an expansion.
Mike, Houston, Texas.
Good morning.
Morning.
Well, here's an economic principle I'd like to share, and that is in regard to the minimum wage. Your pay raise, in regard to the minimum wage, your pay raise becomes effective when your skills go beyond making, which is good. It's good. When you're 18 and 20 years old, you're learning the fundamentals of getting to work on time, working with others, and 17 and whatever age. But entry-level people don't make $20,000. Don't make $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year because they're working part-time and full-time. They're going to school. So it's a natural extension that their pay raise is going to be effective when they develop their skills. Second point, the states. New Mexico. New Mexico's annual revenue, state revenue, is way up because of manufacturing jobs, specifically in the oil and gas sector. And that is directly attributable to Donald Trump. And Trump deserves that credit. And income is up under Trump. It just is. And the new normal was the phrase under Obama, where, people weren't actually making more money. They were just literally flatline income. So manufacturing jobs are way up. And that means, more oil and gas, which when you have lower prices on oil and gas, it affects the poorest Americans the most.
Okay. Sarah Cheney, any thoughts on what Mike had to say?
Thanks for that, Mike. Lots of interesting thoughts there. So I think in particular what I can speak to is unemployment and jobs trends by age group. It is interesting that teen labor force participation has really been on a downward trend for a couple of decades, and especially like during the summers, is the teen summer job even alive anymore, given the fact that so many teens nowadays are, taking summer classes during those months where you might have typically had a summer job at a fast food restaurant or something like that.
Goodell in Holland, Michigan.
Oh, good morning, Sarah. And, we really appreciate C-SPAN here in Holland, Michigan. I support President Trump. I'm a real Democrat, but we've got such a great economy here in Holland, Michigan. But our relatives in Milwaukee started the first workmen's compensation law in 1912, and we help the worker here in Holland. We believe in taxing automation, robots, artificial intelligence, and so forth. We also believe in what's called national capitalism to create what's called real wealth. Here in West Michigan, we've got millions of dollars, billions of dollars worth of oil and so forth, and we'll become like North Dakota with our booming economy. So thank you for your wonderful program, and good luck there in C-SPAN, Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Sarah Cheney, what are you and other economic reporters watching for in the coming weeks and months on the economy?
We'll definitely be watching for any signs of slowdown or pickup / resilience. Economies overseas, like the Eurozone and parts of Asia, have been slowing. And given how interconnected the global economy is, it remains to be seen to what effect the U.S. will, all of those factors, the slowing global growth, will ricochet back to the U.S. So we'll be watching a lot of different metrics to see how that plays out. Manufacturing is a really important one because the sector is so globally exposed. If you're a manufacturer, you're both exporting and importing different products, and so tariffs are definitely something that impact a lot of manufacturers, and have a lot of economists have been saying that tariffs and the trade war have been underpinning some of what's happening overseas and in the U.S. So we'll be kind of watching to see how all of this shakes out.
You can follow Sarah Cheney's reporting if you go to the Wall Street Journal, WSJ.com. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Greta.
Up next, we'll talk to University of Virginia Sabados Crystal Ball managing editor Kyle Kondik. We'll talk about the impeachment inquiry and how that could impact campaign 2020.
Saturday night on Book TV at 11 p.m. Eastern.
If we don't tell our own stories, others will tell them for us. And they won't have the same care and concern that we do. And what happens, this is an important thing for all of us. I'm a privacy advocate, and it was very hard. It was actually harder to tell this story, to tell my story, than it was to come forward and really actually risk my freedom and potentially my life to tell the world about everything that was going on.
Former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden talks about exposing the U.S. government's mass surveillance program and going into exile in his book, Permanent Record. Then Sunday, live at noon Eastern, In Depth, with journalist Naomi Klein.
This was the hottest summer on record. We have never had so little Arctic sea ice. We are losing huge swaths of the Amazon. We have lost much of the Great Barrier Reef. These are the major features of our planet: the Arctic, the Amazon, the Great Barrier Reef. And we are, as my friend Bill McKibben says, breaking them.
Ms. Klein talks about her books, which include On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, No Logo, and The Shock Doctrine. Join in the conversation live with your phone calls, tweets, and Facebook messages. And at 9 Eastern on Afterwards. In his latest book, Deceiving the Sky, Washington Times national security columnist Bill Gertz talks about China's efforts to become a global military and economic superpower. He's interviewed by Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs.
Everyone is looking at the Chinese economic threat. And as you mentioned, the White House was very successful in highlighting this threat. They issued a report with the stunning title called China's Economic Aggression. And there was a huge policy fight with the bureaucrats saying, oh, we can't say economic aggression. But when you read the report, you understand why.
Watch Book TV every weekend on C-SPAN 2. Washington Journal continues.
At our table this morning, Kyle Kondik, who is the managing editor at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, Sabados Crystal Ball. Talk about impeachment inquiry and the impact on campaign 2020. So have you seen this inquiry impacting the campaign yet on the federal level, I mean, the presidential level and down the ticket?
I think it's hard to, we're really just at the start of this process, so we have to kind of look at it a little bit more. I think what we definitely have seen is that Democrats, at least, have coalesced around the idea of impeaching and removing the president. Previously, support for impeachment was somewhat low, in part because I think there was a small but significant number of Democrats who were taking their cues from party leadership and not supporting impeaching and removing the president. And then once Speaker Pelosi and the party sort of coalesced around the idea, you've seen almost every member of the House, Democratic member of the House, not every single one, but almost all of them coalesce around this effort. I think it's the base has sort of gotten the message that it's time to move ahead on impeachment, and so you've seen shifts in that self-identified Democrats becoming more supportive of impeachment. Independents, it's sort of mixed. There's been a small shift with Republicans, but Republicans are still overwhelmingly opposed to impeachment. So the polls are kind of mixed on impeachment, but they were sort of opposed to impeachment prior to basically the Ukraine story. And then in terms of the political impacts, again, I think it's sort of hard to see, but I think at least for Democrats, it's probably reassuring to some degree that they've come out more forcefully for impeachment, and public opinion has moved, particularly amongst Democrats. If that didn't happen, I think that would be a warning sign to Democrats that maybe they're going too fast here. Maybe they are still going too fast, but they're getting some positive early signs from the polling.
Well, what did you make of it when those 9 freshmen who in 2018 won districts that President Trump had won came together to say on this Ukraine story, we're for impeachment now?
Yeah, look, I think that a lot of Democrats felt that this wasn't a good idea maybe prior to the Ukraine story coming out. And really, I do think the speaker works with her most vulnerable members in mind, which I think is basically a smart way to run a caucus, because if you don't look out for your most vulnerable members, you may not be speaker in a couple of years. And so we've seen a number of these kind of national security-oriented Democrats from moderate, maybe Trump won districts coming out for impeachment, which leads me to suggest that they felt like there was something substantively different about this Ukraine story that was different and was more warranted impeachment, or rather, at least it would have been easier potentially to sell impeachment to the public than it was over the Mueller report.
React to this headline, Politico, September 25th. Democrats fear impeachment blowback in 2020. Some party officials in early nominating states think a D.C. spectacle will play right into Trump's re-election strategy.
Yeah, it certainly could. I mean, there is some risk involved in doing this, particularly, and it's, we always bring up Bill Clinton's impeachment, and Richard Nixon probably would have been impeached and removed had he not resigned. But it's not really even comparable to those instances because we're seeing impeachment pursued here in advance of a one-term president trying to win a second term, whereas Nixon and Clinton were both in their second elected terms. They couldn't run again, so it's just a different calculation. And I think there's a part of the public who believes that even people who maybe don't think that Trump should be reelected to think that, hey, the public should ultimately decide this in November 2020. And I think what Democrats would say is that given the gravity of what the president is doing here, namely essentially trying to get foreign assistance in his own political goals, that in and of itself is a threat to the election itself. At least indirectly, and that maybe sort of taints the process and pushes their hands on impeachment here.
Yeah, the Atlantic headline: the risks of impeachment are overblown.
Yeah, and again, it might be particularly because you have seen public opinion move along a little bit here on impeachment. That said, I think if you look at the polls in general, I think there probably are still a small but significant number of people who don't approve of the president but don't necessarily approve of impeaching and removing him either. And if if you look at the general electoral map and think back to 2016, the president was able to win despite not winning the popular vote. If the vote looks like his approval and disapproval rating, he's probably not going to win because his approval rating is only in the low 40s. Disapproval's over 50. Even with the president's demographic advantages in the swing states, if he's losing the national popular vote by high single digits, he's not going to win. But if the national popular vote looks more like these impeachment polling numbers, where maybe impeachment is favored by only by a few points, then it's a much trickier question as to whether the Democrats can win or whether the president will get reelected. So I do think there's still some tricky ground here, but we also got to remember that there are new developments coming out about the story all the time. I mean, there might be a new one that comes out while we're speaking on the air here. I mean, it's been this sort of fire hose of news. And I think what Democrats are hopeful for is that this inquiry allows them to dig up more, and that also that there's more to dig up, which, based on the recent reporting, seems like that very well may be the case.
What are the numbers? How have you seen them? What were the numbers before this crazy story on impeachment? How have you seen them change?
So different polls have different answers on this. Let me bring up one Quinnipiac, national pollster. They had polled impeachment pretty recently, and they found 57% opposed, 37% support. So pretty stark difference. Then they came back earlier this week, and it was 47-47 tied in terms of impeachment or removal. And the trends that you saw in that poll have mirrored the trends in other polls. Now, some polls suggest that impeachment is outright favored, not overwhelmingly favored, but outright favored. But in that Quinnipiac poll, you saw Democrats consolidating around impeachment and removal of the president. You saw Republicans pretty overwhelmingly opposed, but maybe not quite as opposed as they were before. And independents, I think, were still was slightly opposed in that poll, but different polls say different things on that. 538, the politics website, they've been started to do a impeachment polling average, and I was just looking at it before we came in here. They basically found that it was roughly tied in terms of whether people wanted to impeach or remove the president or to let him stay in office.
What if it gets above 50%?
Well, I think if you start to see more consolidation around removal, look, to actually remove the president, you're going to need 20 Republican senators along with a unified Democratic bloc. And it's not even clear to me that every single Democratic senator today would vote to convict the president if, in fact, there was a trial in the Senate. However, if public opinion starts to move, that would probably mean that a larger and larger slice, not just of independents, but of Republicans would actually start coming out in favor of impeachment, and politicians can read polls, and so that would help Republicans believe that if they don't move to impeach, that very well could cost them the White House in 2020. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is do Republicans get to a point where they feel like Donald Trump does not give them their best chance to win the White House in 2020? Are they better off nominating someone else? But there's also, there are actually two pieces of the structure of impeachment and removal. There's of removal in the Senate trial. So first of all, you need 2/3 vote to convict, but there's also a separate vote that would bar a removed president from running for re-election. I believe that's just a majority vote. So, there's actually an interesting op-ed in the Politico magazine recently that suggested that maybe the Senate could remove the president but allow him to run for re-election. So he wouldn't be able to use the White House for his own personal benefit, but he'd be eligible to run for re-election if people wanted to vote him back in. And it's still very difficult to imagine a Republican actually defeating this president in a Republican primary, almost no matter what happens. And I bring all this up to say I don't know the answers, but just think all these moving pieces that are potentially part of it. But if the Republican base stays solid, then that'll be a message to Republican leadership to also stay solid for the president, and then it becomes very difficult to actually remove him.
Let's get our viewers involved in this conversation. The impeachment inquiry impact on campaign 2020. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. What are the president's numbers right now in general election matchups?
Generally speaking, he's losing to the leading Democrats. Joe Biden usually does a little bit better than the other Democrats, but usually in many of these polls, he's losing nationally to Bernie Sanders, to Kamala Harris, to Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren. Not in super blowout numbers, although some polls are indicative of that, and some of the state level polls are a little bit more mixed. I would say that those polls are not really predictive at this point, but look, I think they are suggestive of what you might expect for a president whose approval rating is generally stuck in the low 40s. And one, I think, concerning side for the president is, here's what we got to remember, is that President won in 2016 in large part because he was able to win a larger share of voters who held an unfavorable view of both Trump and Hillary Clinton. And remember, both Trump and Clinton, really unpopular. According to the National Exit Poll, about a fifth of the electorate had a negative view of both Clinton and of Trump. Amongst that group, Trump won, according to the exit poll, 47% to 30%. So for as much as we talk about Trump's base is super solid and his people will never go against him, I think that's true for a lot of people who voted for Trump. But I don't think it's true for every single person who voted for the president. And in some of these polls, and again, take it with a grain of salt because they're not necessarily predictive this early on, but the president sometimes is, like for instance in the Fox News national polls, the president will be at maybe low 40s in terms of approval, but in ballot tests against named Democrats, he's actually running below that. That there's in those polls, there's a small number of people who approve his job performance who aren't ready to say they support him yet. Generally speaking, the approval number is a pretty good proxy for what an incumbent president would expect to get. Obviously, this president either needs to raise his approval or needs to win people who disapprove of his job performance. But it's not actually even clear that at this point every single person who approves of him is ready to vote for him. So that's a challenge. Now the president has some assets. We just saw earlier this week that the Republican National Committee and the president have really done a great job fundraising. The president was outgunned in terms of resources in 2016. He may very well have an advantage in 2020, at least in the earlier part of the process when the Democrats are spending all their money on the actual primary. And so he's going to be able to run a more robust campaign than he did before. But I also wonder about the actual campaign effects of that money, particularly in a place where people are already so motivated. They already know generally how they feel about the president. I think money maybe makes a little bit more difference down the ballot when maybe the candidates aren't quite as well known.
Before we get to calls, size up the Democratic field because you saw Elizabeth Warren bring in some big money in this last quarter. Bernie Sanders just let go of the hospital, discharged from the hospital after suffering a heart attack is what we're learning this morning. And then, of course, Joe Biden is part of this Ukraine story.
So the big story of this calendar year, if you go back to January, a lot of it's been pretty stable. Joe Biden has generally been the polling leader. It's about 30%. He got a spike when he announced, then that spike faded. It seems like Pete Buttigieg kind of has I feel like when Buttigieg rose, Beto O'Rourke sort of dropped, but they're both of them are sort of polling in single digits generally. Kamala Harris spiked at a various point, but then she's sort of fallen off. The big story's been Warren in that at the start of the year she was only about 4 or 5%. Now she's more at 20% or even higher, to the point where I think it's fair to look at her as sort of a co-front runner with Joe Biden, with Bernie Sanders sort of in third at this particular point. And the other thing that's really great for Warren and bad for Biden is that Biden, a lot of his supporters are African American, and he does really well amongst African American respondents to polls as opposed to white voters and even other non-white voters. But Iowa, New Hampshire, the leadoff contests, and both of those states are almost entirely white. So we're going to be leading off with states that are not favorable to Biden. And remember, that was true. Hillary Clinton had a similar kind of coalition. Clinton was able to win Iowa very narrowly, got blown out in New Hampshire, but it didn't really materially affect her. But Biden is also not as strong not nearly as strong as Clinton was, this time 4 years ago.
Let's go to Dominic in New York. Independent, go ahead with your question or comment.
Yeah, good morning.
Morning.
Hi, how are you? I'm going to get 2 points. Number one, they've been impeaching the president since day one. I listened to that hearing that Adam Schiff, the chairman, read a transcript of a phone call to the intelligence guy that was subpoenaed. That was a lie. And they're doing everything to destroy this president because they don't want him to win again. But as far as winning, there's no way you could do.
Okay.
And you had your last guy talking about that we're giving Obama credit. Obama has to do with the tax cuts and the Jobs Act. He brought all these companies back. I remember Obama saying, "What do you imagine? One of these companies never come back. All back." He went to Chrysler nicely. Listen, you want to stay in Mexico? God bless you. Every car that comes across the border is $10,000. You know what? They're all back.
Okay, a couple things that he brings up that I want you to respond to. He says, where would the president lose?
Well, I think that if in fact the president doesn't win re-election, in terms of like patterns of support, he probably would do worse in suburbs and big cities than he did in 2016, and probably would lose a little bit, not a ton, off of his very imposing margins in sort of the non-urban Midwest and heartland areas, which were so important to him. Now, I do think that I wouldn't be so confident if I were the caller and the president winning again, but I think it's basically still sort of a 50-50 proposition. And I do think that the president is helped by the fact that we did get another good economic report yesterday, and that we are in a time of general peace and prosperity. But normally you would think in a time of peace and prosperity you would have a president with approval rating over 50%, and that person would be more clearly favored for re-election. So I think a lot of people will say, oh, Teflon Don, president, he can do all this stuff, he never pays any sort of price for it. I would argue that he does pay a price for it because his approval rating doesn't have to be as low as it is. And if you look back to the midterm, the Democrats didn't have to win 40 seats in the House. Yes, historically, the president's party struggles in the midterm, but I think a lot of that was a negative reaction to the way that the president behaves in office. And certainly, it's hard to argue that the president is losing support over this Ukraine story because, again, his approval rating, while generally weak, is not abysmally bad. It's not like George W. Bush at the end of his presidency when he was in 25-30%, or Jimmy Carter at various points. But it has been stable, but it also has been stable and weak. And again, that doesn't have to be that way, but the way that the president behaves a lot of the time, I think, it exerts sort of a downward pressure when otherwise some of the other things that are going on in the country, some of the things that the caller mentioned, would exert sort of an upward pressure on that approval rate.
Let's go to Dallas, Texas. Mary, a Republican.
Yes, I would like to bring up, am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I wanted to bring up a House member that took an impeachment vote shortly after he was put in as president. And I would like to know what the American people would think of that, of 4 years of impeachment. I'll take it off phone.
I'm not necessarily sure what's being referred to there. The previous caller did say that he felt like the Democrats have been trying to impeach the president the whole time, which I think there's some fairness to that, although I think it's also reasonable to expect an opposition party to go very strongly after the incumbent president. Certainly Republicans didn't give any quarter to Barack Obama, and that's sort of the way the two-party system works, that the two sides aggressively try to hold each other accountable.
Gladys, Longview, Texas, Democratic caller.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead, Gladys.
All right. It's just that this president's been corrupt from day one. It's just everything he put his hands on, it crumbles. Look how he did the immigrants. He talking about putting alligators and snakes at this thing. I mean, come on, man.
All right, Gladys's thoughts. Glenn in Lancaster, California, Republican.
Donald Trump. He's the hardest working president we've ever had. With the corrupt FBI that never looked at where the dossier came from, where Hillary's cloud strike people over there in Ukraine.
Whatever you have, come on, let's give it a whirl. See, I've been watching you, and I like the way you move. So go ahead, girl, just do that ass shaking thing you do. So you grab your girls and you grab a couple more, and you all can meet me in the middle of a let's make it smell right. So you pass to the left and you sail to the right. Let's see, I wanna rock your body. You don't have to get your
said it's December. So I should have said that.
District, and then the upper second congressional district is sort of more working class, probably a little less touristy, less liberal, and that district is supposed to Trump. So Trump got an electoral vote from Maine in 2016, and Collins has succeeded, I think, in part because she's well in the northern part of the state, but she's also attracted tremendous amount of crossover support from otherwise Democratic-leaning voters in all over the state, but I think particularly in that first congressional district. If that race gets super nationalized, if she loses her crossover support, she'd be in trouble. Now again, I don't think that's happened yet, and I still think she's a small favorite to win. But I think she's in for the hardest election of her time as senator. And the Senate vote on the president, I think, is not something that she would be looking forward to.
And that says something because she always has a tough race.
Yeah. Well, so. But, she's won pretty convincingly over the years. Even in 2008, she had a good opponent. It was, Obama was winning the state by a lot, and she still ended up doing quite well.
We don't seem to focus on her as much.
Oh, well, that's true. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Because she is, there aren't really that many actual moderates in the Senate anymore. And is Collins a straight down the line moderate? No, I mean, she's a Republican. But she's a little less conservative than the rest of her caucus. But she's one of the few that really remain. And, Joe Manchin on the Democratic side is sort of, I think, her kind of equivalent.
All right. Homerville, Georgia. John, Independent. You're next.
Yes, I have a question involving process because impeachment is such a important procedure, which the House Judiciary Committee, through its chairman, has the right under the present rules of the House to launch a impeachment inquiry, absent a full vote of the House.
Well, let me read from Politico to answer your question. Impeachment always starts in the House. The sitting Speaker of the House must give her approval for impeachment proceedings to begin. And they say below that the House committees investigate and then they write articles of impeachment. If the Judiciary Committee approves any articles of impeachment, the full House will vote on the charges against the President. This is why the Speaker says, it's not required that to begin this process, I have to have a full House vote. He's saying she starts it. She's approved this process, and so it goes to the committees and they begin to investigate. Do you want to add something?
No, not particularly. You know, again, this has been sort of a dispute between the Republicans in the House and the Democrats in the House, but as you say, and I'm glad you had the article there, because some of the legal machinations here are a little tricky. But yeah, eventually, you know, if the House wants to actually impeach the president, vote on it, and people are going to have to go on the record.
And a majority, as you said earlier, is required in the House. At least 218 of 435 representatives are needed to approve any of the articles of impeachment presented by the Judiciary Committee. And then when it comes to the impeachment vote, as you were saying.
And at this point, it seems clear that not every single Democrat is on board, but you do have enough to produce a majority, and then you'd also expect that from Vermont, the former Republican, now independent, in the Grand Rapids area, to vote for impeachment. I don't necessarily know if other Republican members of the House, or if any Republican members of the House vote for impeachment, although, depending on how things go, you can imagine some coming on board.
Can't really move.
At this point, not that many.
And after the trial, the Senate would vote, and 2/3 majority is required there, or 67 of 100 senators.
And remember the math here. So the House, the Senate is 53-47, Republican at 47 for the Democrats, including two independents, Bernie Sanders of Maine, of Vermont, Angus King of Maine. So you need all 47 Democrats and you need 20 Republicans, which is 35-40% of their caucus, which they don't have. I think that Romney is able to predict. There may be a few others, but at this point, I don't see a lot of senators willing to break the White House that way.
Lori in Winslow, New Jersey, Democratic College.
Yes, I would just like to mention to Kyle, since he's not a legal scholar, that the full House is embodied to call for a vote in order to impeach the president, not Nancy Pelosi walking up to the microphone like she's Eva Peron and having that done. And we do that so that the other side has the opportunity to defend themselves and call for a subpoena. And as far as Ukraine, well, let's see what we have here. You want the President of the United States to give somebody millions more of dollars so that we can have Joe Biden's son, Nancy Pelosi's son in 2017. He went there too, and she's on a promotional video with a gift company for her son, and John Kerry's son. And they're taking money out of what we're giving in tax money, they're taking it out in salary. So you know what we call that in Italian, since they like to quote the mafia so much? I'm going to give you an offer you can't refuse, okay? That's called money laundering. So that's why the president has the right as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America to investigate where taxpayer money is going to. And that's only three, the three sons. We don't know what else is going on for all these years. We didn't even mention the Clinton Foundation that she funneled in millions of dollars from foreign governments in a secret server that she deleted so that nobody could investigate it. So don't tell me about the President of the United States. He's there 3 years. He's been accused for 3 years and nothing has been accused of any evidence. All you did was travel over the street. And you know what it is? It's the news media. The news media who does investigate anything and just puts it up there. And speaking of that, how do you think, what happened to Roy Moore?
because they didn't take into account the widening difference in amongst white voters in terms of education level, and they basically oversampled white voters with a four-year college degree, and that made the electorates seem more democratic. That said, I think this idea that, hey, actually the president is super popular and impeachment has no support, I think that's because here's the thing. Even if you want to quibble with the polls, the midterm did offer a good barometer here, and the midterm, I think, was pretty strong rejection of the president in places that were sort of middle of the road or Democratic leaning. Now, Republicans did pick up, ended up netting 2 Senate seats, and that was largely in kind of dark red states, although they also won Florida, which I think was very impressive for the Republicans. But generally speaking, the midterm, I think, helped confirm the reality, which is that the president is not, he's not dead in the water, but he is also not popular broadly.
Jan in Flint, Michigan, Independent.
Yes, I agree with the woman who called a couple times ago. I've been watching this whole impeachment process, and it's just so biased. I watched CNN last night, and Debbie Dingell, who's the representative from Detroit, was on, and she was a no vote on impeachment. And she said that she get so much pressure from Tom Steyer and MoveOn.org, she was forced to change her vote to yes. And I believe Debbie Dingell because I feel she's honest. She's, I probably wouldn't vote for her, but I feel she's honest. I think she does a good job. And as far as the Biden, what evidence that Joe Biden and the Democrats...
Jan, I'm going to leave it there just so we can focus on what you're talking about, the pressure that Democrats are feeling from outside groups, like Tom Steyer, who put a lot of money behind the impeachment movement early on.
Yeah, I think that, for a long time, the speaker kind of helped shield some of her members in more vulnerable districts from that pressure. So again, look, Democrats trying hard to find President Trump. They feel like that he's illegitimate, that he's committed crimes in office. Again, Republicans obviously don't agree with that. But then there's also some feeling, and the speaker has expressed this in the past, that we should have this election. Again, the Ukraine story changed some opinions, and so in terms of the outside pressure, I think the Democrats are doing a good job in the sense that they want to be pushed into it by activists, but the events changed to such a point where they felt like they had to get involved. Now, do the activists pushing maybe help them get to that point? Potentially, but again, they were resistant to that, again, until the Ukraine story went past.
Peter in Florida, Democratic caller.
Hi, how are you?
Morning.
Thanks for having me. I'd like to just make a few comments on Mr. Trump here, and just what are we going to do with all these national secrets and how things are run there in the White House? That's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that after his term or if he gets impeached, that all this information that's released to him, we know that he's doing this for his own gain. What about afterwards? How do we protect ourselves from something like that?
Okay, well, Peter, Kyle Gunn is not a legal expert on what would happen after.
Well, let me make a point about this, though, is we do know that if the president loses in 2020, he will say that the vote was illegitimate. I just feel very confident in saying that. Because he basically suggested the vote was illegitimate in 2016, in which he won. And I think that he would continue to be out of office, whether it's 2020, 2021, or 2025. I think he would continue to be a lightning rod figure and someone who got a lot of attention. What he would do with the things that he knows, who knows? But that is something just to think about in terms of the future, again, be it 2020 or 2024.
Mike in Sumter, South Carolina, Republican.
Yes, ma'am. How are you this
Good
morning?
morning.
Hey, listen, I was just telling he's a pollster, Cal there's a pollster, and I'd like to know, on these polls, ever since the first election, they had Donald Trump losing. I went to bed that night, they had Donald Trump losing. So where are you guys getting your information from? Who are you polling? I've never been asked. I'm a black man in South Carolina. I have never been asked on a poll. I've never seen them in South Carolina getting a poll result.
Let's take that.
So there are a lot of different things that go into polling, and it's a very challenging industry. First of all, here's the kind of gold standard polling is done through telephone calls. And increasingly, obviously, a lot of people just have cell phones now. And for various legal reasons, it is more expensive to call cell phones, basically. And so there are a lot of national pollsters who do that, and they end up having to make a ton of calls just to get the requisite number of respondents, be it 500 or 1,000 or what have you. And then you have pollsters that are doing work online now, which I think is the future is. Polls. Again, I will say that the polling at the end now reflected what happened, but I think that Clinton had bigger leads at various points. I think there's some lessons for leading the polls in 2016 as well. Not only were there a fair number of undecideds in 2016, because again, Clinton and Trump both had pretty poor favorability numbers, and so a lot of voters didn't necessarily know what they wanted to do. And so the more undecided there are in a poll, the less confident we should be that it definitively will show a leader, unless that person gets like 15, 20 points or something. And also in 2016, we did have a substantial third-party vote, particularly as expressed in polls. Gary Johnson, a libertarian, would sometimes be getting 9-10% in polls. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, maybe was getting half that or a little bit less than half that. And what we know from polls is that third-party candidates almost always poll better than they actually perform on election. So think about this. You've got the combination of all these undecideds, this higher number of undecideds in 2016, and also higher support from third parties that we know historically they're going to get. Put it all together, and I think there probably should have been more uncertainty about polling than there was. And that's a lesson that I think I take, and I think other people should take, be it people in the press or also just people who observe politics.
Let's talk about House races before we let you go. Which ones are you watching?
I think a lot of the races that are interesting are people who are in the news. Alyssa Slotkin, for instance, in Michigan Dade Congressional District. She's one of these kind of national security Democrats who I think had to be kind of pushed along. I think that this impeachment, so she finally decided that she wanted to support it. Now Republicans are still looking for a candidate in that seat. Mike Bishop, a former Republican incumbent, a lot of Republicans want him to run. He doesn't seem all that excited about doing it. Republicans did get, there have been a number of candidate announcements over the past week in some places. The Washington State Congressional District, for instance, that's a kind of a classic swing district that the Democrats captured in 2018 after failing to capture it in previous elections. There's 31 Democrats in districts that Donald Trump carried in 2016. The Republicans need to win about 20 seats to win the House back, and those 31 Trump district Democrats are the ones who think that they will target. Because again, I mentioned this nationalization of politics. If the president can win the election and also do well in those districts, he might be able to carry enough Republicans to victory to win the House. Another person that I think is really interesting, member of the House, is Max Rose. He's a Democrat who just recently won the district in coverage of Staten Island. Staten Island is kind of this pocket of conservatism in the midst of a very liberal and very democratic New York City. Rose just recently came out for the impeachment inquiry after sort of resisting it. Staten Island is the president, I think, is probably holding up reasonably well in popularity. That's another seat that I think, if you're trying to figure out the seat Republicans need in the House, that's probably something to look at. So again, there are some members who are sticking their necks out at impeachment, who maybe didn't want to do that, but they feel like it's important enough. They feel like maybe when it's all said and done, that this will ultimately benefit them. But it's an open question as to whether it's wrong.
For a closer look, you can go to centerforpolitics.org/crystalball. Kyle Condit, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, return to our question that we asked all of you. Did President Trump commit an impeachable offense? You think he did? 202-748-8000. If you say no, 202-748-8001. This week on Newsmakers, we sat down with former Republican Congressman from Pennsylvania, Jim Greenwood, who is now the president and CEO of BIO, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and we talked about drug prices and possible legislation. Airs Sunday at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Here's a little bit of that interview.
What you hear constantly is the phrase skyrocketing drug prices. So it's a complete misnomer. Here's what, don't take my word for it, this is what the White House just said recently, that in the last 12 months, the average price of drugs in this country is going down 27%. So drug prices are not, as a whole, increasing. They're actually going down. Now, the way the system works is some prices go up, but as long as during a period of time, sometimes when the drug is on its patent, and when the patent ends, it becomes a generic drug, and then the price drops and it drops dramatically. 90% of all the prescriptions that people take are generics. So it's not the case that drug prices on the whole are escalating. When you look at what the Pelosi bill does, it would absolutely, and this is not an exaggeration, it would destroy the future of medicine. Because what it says is, what we're going to do is we're going to take a set of drugs that will cost some money, and we're going to have some federal bureaucracy determine what the price of those drugs is going to be. Now imagine yourself as an investor in drugs. And you're looking at 10 companies you might invest in one, and all 10 of them, you know you're going to lose your money on 9, but maybe one of those 10 will become a product that gets through the FDA and gets approved. And you're going to risk a lot of money in that endeavor. And then you have to anticipate that if you're lucky enough to get one who's approved, some bureaucrat somewhere is going to tell you what the price is. How could you ever invest under those conditions? You have to know that at the end of the day, if you get your product approved, you can set a price that's going to allow you to recover your expenses. The Pelosi bill doesn't do that, and it's so unnecessary, and it is so destructive of the hope that patients have when they consider the new science that's available to them.
Washington Journal continues. And we are back this morning. We will end here in the Washington Journal with where we began. Do you think President Trump committed an impeachable offense? The latest on the impeachment inquiry from the Associated Press, the impeachment probe reaches into the White House with a new subpoena. The Democrats there asking the White House for documents, all documents related to Ukraine. You also have the Vice President getting a subpoena from House Democrats. They want from him all Ukraine documents. Also this morning, the Business Insider has this story from the New York Times. Second intelligence official is considering filing a whistleblower complaint about Trump and Ukraine. This one with more direct knowledge of the phone call, according to the New York Times. And then also the Washington Examiner saying that the Secretary of State failed to provide Ukraine documents by House subpoena deadline, which was yesterday. President Trump on Thursday asked by a reporter, what specifically did you want out of that phone call with the Ukraine leader? Here's how he responded.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Biden. It's a very simple answer. They should investigate the Biden. Because how does a company that's newly formed, and all these companies, if you look at, and by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Biden. Because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine. So I would say that President Zelensky, if it were me, I would recommend that they start an investigation into the Biden. Because nobody had any doubt that they weren't crooked. That was a crooked deal, 100%. He had no knowledge of energy, didn't know the about, because I'm sure that President Xi does not like being under that kind of scrutiny, where billions of dollars. You know what they call that? They call that a payoff.
President Trump, early Thursday morning. Later in the morning, the intelligence chair, Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, responds to what he heard from the president.
Once again, have the President of the United States suggesting, urging foreign countries to interfere in our presidential elections. This is an illustration that this president has learned anything from the 2 years of the Mueller investigation is that he feels he can do anything with impunity. The President of the United States encouraging a foreign nation to interfere and to help his campaign by investigating Iran is a fundamental breach of the president's oath of office. It endangers our elections, it endangers our national security. It ought to be condemned by every member of this body, Democrats and Republicans alike.
Did the president commit an impeachable offense? Robert says yes, in Southeastern. Good morning. Southeastern Massachusetts, is that it? Is that where you're calling from? Robert? Okay, sorry, couldn't see that. Go ahead.
Well, I'm on the line saying, no, he should not be impeached. The only people that are straightening this whole thing out is the atomic cleanup veterans.
All right, John in San Antonio, you say no. John?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that Operation Crossfire Hurricane was predicated on the Steele dossier, which is Russian disinformation. It's opposition research. So I don't want to hear from Democrats that, oh, Trump is trying to get countries to help him interfere in the election. The biggest election interference is the Steele dossier.
Okay, John's thoughts there. Judy in Greenwood Lake, New York. You say yes, he has. Why do you say that?
Oh, yes, he definitely has and should be impeached. Am I on?
Yes, but impeached for what, Judy? What do you think he is?
Well, okay, here's the thing. What really bothers me is the other side, how they get such information wrong and run with it. Well, first of all, he withheld funds to Ukraine, and there's so much already in text messages. Why don't they believe our own FBI and our own CIA? Why do they think it's okay to withhold information from Congress? Congress works for us, the people. They should, if they haven't done anything wrong, they should be willing to give all kinds of information to the Congress to prove that they've done nothing wrong. They obstruct, and it's not just the president, but Barr and Pompeo and Pence. I mean, for crying out loud, all of them need to be investigated. And the Republicans that call your phone line and say things that are so untrue and have such misinformation about reality, it scares me. What's happening to our country? At least get your information correct. And then maybe they should be corrected when they're saying things that are not correct.
Well, and that's part of the conversation with all of you. You hear something, you call up, and you can talk about what you've heard from another caller, disagree, dispute what they're having to say. Dick in Ann Arbor, you say no to impeaching the president.
Yes, I should be impeached. This has been going on since after he's nominated, and I think the Democrats are just looking for something to impeach on, as opposed to here's an act of going to impeach him. So this has been going on before he's elected, and in this case, the Democrats have the press on their side. The percentage unfavorable press for Trump is ridiculous.
Dick, can I ask you to respond to this Business Insider article? Justice Department veterans say Trump could be accused of breaking 4 laws in the Ukraine whistleblower scandal. And this is what they say inside the article. Illegally soliciting campaign help from a foreign government. The most obvious way in which Trump could have violated laws by soliciting your campaign from a foreign government.